He was the first person in 2 days who had said her name and meant it as a courtesy rather than a transaction, and that alone was almost enough to make her sit down on the boardwalk and cry. She didn't. She had learned not to, but she thought about it later, when she was warm and fed and the door of the cook's cabin was latched from the inside, and she decided it counted as a kind of miracle, the small frontier kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself and doesn't care if you were ready for it. Stay with me, because this is a story about what one plain act of decency can become, when the soil is right and the person receiving it has enough left in them to let it grow. The town of Harlan's Crossing sat at the bottom of a wide valley, like something the land had coughed up and forgotten about. 3 blocks of dusty Main Street, a water tower that leaned, a general store, a saloon, a church with a broken bell, and about 400 souls who had made their peace with the fact that nothing was going to improve any time soon. Delamarche arrived on a Wednesday in October, which the town noted and then moved on from, the way it moved on from most things. She was 23 years old, though she looked older in the way that hardship ages people. Not in the face exactly, but behind the eyes, in the way she scanned every street before she moved and measured exits and expressions, with the wariness of someone who had needed to do that for some time now. She had dark brown hair pulled into a bun at the nape of her neck, already coming loose in the wind, strands whipping across her face. Hazel eyes, green in good light, brown in shade, that held something watchful and very still. Strong cheekbones, a straight nose, a mouth that might have smiled easily once and had since grown careful about the occasions it chose. She was slight, but not fragile, the kind of thin that comes from not eating enough. Her clothes said everything a careful person needed to know. A grey wool travelling dress, mended at the hem, the cuffs turned back and stitched to hide where they had frayed. A man's coat, 2 sizes too large, that had belonged to someone else, and had been her best protection against the cold for longer than it should have been. She had 40 cents in her coat pocket. She knew the exact amount without checking, because she had been counting it in her head since Abilene. The plan had been to find her mother's cousin, a woman named Frances Galt, who had written 6 months prior to say she could use a hand at her boarding house in Harlan's Crossing, and that Della should come if she had a mind to. Della had waited too long, the way she always waited too long, which was a habit born from the understanding that movement costs something, and she had rarely had enough to spare. When she'd finally arrived and found the address on the letter, a neighbor had told her, without particular sympathy, that Frances had sold up and moved to Tucson in July. That had been 2 days ago. She had gone door to door since. The saloon first, the wrong kind of no, with a smirk behind it that made her stomach turn. The general store, not hiring. The hotel, no. The laundry, full up. 6 private houses, 4 non-answers, and 2 doors shut in her face. Last night she had slept in a stall in the livery, in a pile of straw, because the liveryman was not unkind, and the cold had come down serious off the mountains. This morning he had told her apologetically that she couldn't stay another night. It was now 4 in the afternoon. The wind was picking up, and the temperature dropping, and the sun was going to be gone in 2 hours. 40 cents would buy a meal, but not a bed, and she had already eaten. She stood on the boardwalk in front of the depot and tried to think. The general store door across the street swung open, and a man came out carrying 2 sacks of flour on his shoulders, like they were nothing, crossed to a wagon, set them in the bed with a practiced ease that spoke of 1,000 repetitions, and went back inside. She noted him without paying particular attention. She was calculating. When she had run through every option and arrived at nothing, she picked up her carpet bag and walked toward the general store. The man behind the counter was stocky and red-faced, unfamiliar. The owner had turned her down yesterday with a thin-lipped finality. This one looked her up and down with an attention she recognized and did not like. "Help you?" he said, not in the way that meant it. "I'm looking for work," she said. "Any kind. I can cook, I can clean, I can keep accounts, I can take in mending. I'm asking if you know of anyone who needs a hand." He leaned on the counter, smiling. "You don't look like a seamstress to me." "I'm asking a civil question," she said evenly. "I'd be grateful for a civil answer." "Come back after dark," he said, "and we can talk about what kind of answer you're looking for." She held his gaze for 2 seconds. She had learned that looking away too quickly gave people ideas about what she was made of, and then she picked up her carpet bag and walked back out. On the boardwalk she stopped, breathed twice through her nose, looked down the street at nothing. "You've been at this 2 days," said a low voice behind her. "I've seen you going door to door." She turned. He was leaning against the post at the far end of the boardwalk, arms crossed, watching her with an expression that was neither pity nor the particular kind of interest the man inside had expressed. Somewhere in his mid-30s, tall and broad across the shoulder, with the build of a man who does physical work every day, not for show, but because there is work to be done. Dark hair cut short and growing out. Dark eyes set in a face that had spent considerable time in the weather. A jaw that hadn't been shaved in a few days. Canvas work shirt, suspenders, a heavy wool vest. A battered, wide-brimmed hat he'd taken off when he spoke and was holding by the brim. A scar along his left forearm, old and pale, the kind that had stopped being notable long ago. He had been the man with the flour sacks. "That's so," she said. "Not unfriendly. Careful." "Name's Flint Carver," he said. He held out his hand. "I'm not in the habit of addressing strangers without introducing myself first." She looked at the hand, calculated for 1 second, and shook it. "Della Marsh. I heard what that man said to you in there," he said, nodding toward the store. "I'm sorry you had to hear it." "I've heard worse," she said. "That's not a reason for it to be all right." He put his hat back on and looked at her with the directness of a man who has decided the simplest way forward is to say what he means. "I'm going to be plain with you, Miss Marsh, because I think you've earned plain dealing. I run a cattle ranch 6 miles north of here, the Carver spread. My cook quit 3 weeks ago, and I've been managing alone since September. The work is hard, and the hours are long, but the pay is fair, the quarters are private, and nobody there who doesn't want to be there is obliged to stay." She waited. "I'm offering you a job," he said, "and a roof, tonight and on if you want it." The wind came down the street between them, cold and direct as a fact. 40 cents, 2 hours of daylight. "How far is 6 miles in a wagon?" she asked. "Better part of an hour. The wagon's loaded. I can leave now if you can." She picked up her carpet bag. "Then I can." The drive north was mostly silence, which suited her fine. The last of the day's light slanted flat and golden across the open rangeland, turning the grass the color of something burning low and steady, and she sat on the wagon bench watching the land open up around her and tried to assess the situation with the same clear eyes she had learned to use for everything. He told her what she needed to know without being asked. 300 head of cattle, 2 ranch hands, brothers, the Dunbar boys, a barn, a main house, a cook's cabin empty since September. He stated the wage, which was fair, as he had said. He told her the work, 3 meals a day for himself and the hands, help with the kitchen garden if she was willing, general mending around the house, and then, told matter-of-factly and without making anything of it, he told her the cabin door latched from the inside. That detail, plain and practical, offered the same way he had offered everything else, settled something in her chest that had been braced and ready since Abilene. The Carver spread came into view as the last light left the sky. A cluster of low buildings in a fold of land, a windbreak of cottonwood trees to the north, the main house solidly built, lantern light already burning amber in the windows. Nothing beautiful about it in any formal sense, but it was whole and it was lit, and the sight of it did something to her throat that she did not allow to reach her face. He unhitched the horses while she stood in the yard in the gathering dark, and then he showed her the cabin, small, solid, a cast-iron stove, a rope bed with a straw tick mattress, a washstand, a window facing east. He lit the stove for her before he left, and showed her where the firewood was stacked along the outer wall. "Supper's been managed tonight," he said from the doorway. "There's stew in the main house if you want it, and bread, but if you'd rather sleep, there's no obligation." "I'll take the stew," she said, "if it's not a trouble." It was not a trouble. She ate at the kitchen table in the main house, while the two hands, Caleb and Roy Dunbar, young and quieted by a shyness that sat easier on them than hostility, finished their coffee and excused themselves for the night. Flint sat at the far end of the table with a ledger open in front of him, not performing inattention, but genuinely attending to his work in the way of a man with no interest in making a person feel watched. The stew was beef, and it was good, and she ate all of it without apology. When she set down her spoon, "Thank you." He looked up from the ledger. "Sleep well, Miss Marsh." She did. She woke before dawn to the unfamiliar luxury of not knowing where she was, and then she remembered, and she lay still for a full minute listening to the cottonwood trees moving in the wind outside the east window. Not a stranger's barn, not the cold, a stove, a latch on the inside of a door. She was up and had the kitchen fire going and the coffee on before anyone else had stirred. Flint came in at 5:30, stopped in the kitchen doorway, and looked at the coffee pot and then at her. "You didn't have to start this early," he said. "I know," she said. "I prefer to." He sat down at the table and did not argue about it, which she appreciated more than she let on. Over the days that followed, she learned the shape of the place and the rhythm of it. The Dunbar boys were out before light and in for the noon meal, back out until dusk, talking little and working steadily. Flint was everywhere. The fence line in the early morning, the barn, the account ledger in the evenings, fixing something along the south wall of the barn with a focused economy of motion that suggested he had been fixing things alone for a long time and had made his peace with that. He did not overstep. He did not hover. He was present in the way of a man who understood that presence and intrusion were not the same thing, and had perhaps learned this the careful way. She settled in. The work was hard, but familiar. 3 meals a day is 3 meals a day, whether the kitchen is in a rooming house in Salina or a ranch house 6 miles north of Harlan's Crossing, and there was a satisfaction in doing it well in a place that actually needed it done. The kitchen was not organized in any particular way when she arrived. The pantry stocked haphazardly, the preserves from the previous summer unlabeled and puzzling. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized it all, labeled the preserves, found 2 pounds of coffee that had been pushed to the back of a shelf and forgotten, and located the source of a persistent leak in the cabin roof, which she mentioned to Flint, who went up and fixed it the same afternoon. They were not, in those first weeks, what anyone would call friends. They were 2 people occupying a space with a degree of mutual respect, which felt to her, after what she had come from, like extraordinary luxury. She had been on the ranch 2 weeks when they rode into Harlan's Crossing for the supply run, and Dobbins, the store owner who had refused her 10 days prior, refused again, this time formally in front of 2 other customers, saying he didn't extend credit to women traveling without a husband or male guardian, and saying it with the comfortable confidence of a man who had never been called on this particular position. "She's working for me," Flint said. His voice had not changed from its usual register. Something in the room had. "Be that as it may, the order is mine," Flint said. "The list is mine. The money is mine. I don't believe the question of her marital status has any bearing on it." "I run my store how I see fit," Dobbins said. "You do," Flint agreed. He picked up the list from the counter. "And I'll spend my money at Calhoun's in Ridgeback from here on. I buy a great deal of flour, and I buy it year-round." He turned to Della. "Come on." On the way back up the valley road, she said, "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said, and that was the end of it, and she thought about those 3 words for a long time afterward. In November, a man rode onto the carver spread and asked to speak with her. His name was Burl Mackey, and she had known he would come eventually, had been waiting for it the way you wait for weather you can feel in the air days before the clouds show. She had worked for him at a rooming house in Salina, 14 months of cooking and cleaning, and then a slow erosion in which her wages had become optional and her compliance was presumed not to be. She had left on a Tuesday morning in August with only what belonged to her, which was very little. He was broad and ruddy, and accustomed to being the largest presence in any situation. He sat on his horse at the edge of the yard and named a debt that was not real, a figure that represented not what she owed, but what he calculated her silence was worth. He said it with the ease of a man who had made this particular speech before, and had never been answered in any way that cost him. Della stood in the yard and said nothing. Flint came out of the barn. Mackey looked him over with the dismissive calculation of a man measuring an obstacle. "This is a private matter." "You're on my land," Flint said. He was standing very still, arms at his sides. He had not raised his voice, had not moved toward his gun belt, and this stillness was somehow more serious than either of those things would have been. "You're talking to a person who works for me about a debt she doesn't owe. I'll give you one opportunity to say otherwise." Mackey tried once more. Said she had signed a paper. Flint looked at her. "Did you?" "No," she said. "There it is," Flint said to Mackey. A crow called from somewhere in the cottonwoods. The wind moved through the grass in a long, slow wave. Mackey looked at her, then at Flint, then at his own hands on the reins. The calculation was readable in his face. She had seen that calculation before and knew exactly what it was, whether the prize was worth the cost. It wasn't. He turned his horse and rode back down the road without another word, and she watched him go until the dust had settled back to earth. Then she sat down on the porch step, because her legs had decided they were finished standing. Flint sat down on the other end of the step, not close, and said nothing for a while. "How long was he at it?" he asked. 14 months, she said. "More or less." A pause. "Is there anyone else likely to come?" "I don't think so. He's the worst of them." He nodded once, the nod of a man receiving a fact and filing it. "All right, then." He got up and went back to the barn, and she sat on the step until her legs remembered themselves, and then she went to the kitchen and started on supper, because the work was still there, and the work was what she had. The first snow came the 2nd week of November. She stood in the doorway of the cook's cabin and watched it fall, soft and undramatic, the way first snows often are, and felt, to her own surprise, a distinct reluctance to leave. Her plan had been spring, stay through the winter, save the wages, reassess. She had told herself this was practical and not hope. She had almost believed it. In December, Flint asked if she would be willing to take over the household accounts. She looked at him across the ledgers on the kitchen table. "You trust me with that?" "You're better with numbers than I am," he said. "I'm not too proud to say so." She took over the accounts. Over the winter, the long particular silence of a ranch in January and February, when the days contracted to the radius of lantern light and the wind spoke continuously against the cabin walls, she learned things about him the way you learn things about a person when you live in their orbit long enough. Not from what he said, which was spare, but from what he did and what he left undone. He had come from Colorado 7 years ago, after his wife had died. He said this once, plainly, when she asked about the photograph on the kitchen mantelpiece, a younger man and woman in front of a building that wasn't this ranch, both of them squinting in what had been a bright day. He didn't request sympathy, or offer more than the fact. She didn't press. The way he said it told her what she needed to know, that it had broken something in him, And he had built this ranch in the space of that breaking, the way some people build things when their hands need somewhere to be. She told him in return about her father's debts. He had died when she was 19 and left her with nothing but the ledger he'd owed and the men who came to collect it. She told him about the 2 years since, the drift from town to town and the jobs available to a woman alone. She told him about Francis Gall's letter and arriving to find the boarding house shut. He listened with full attention and no performance of it. "You are," he said, when she'd finished, "about the most determined person I have met in a long time." "I had to be," she said. "I know," he said. "I don't mean it as a hard thing. I mean it as the thing it is." In February, Dobbins came to the ranch. His store roof had collapsed under the snow, and he needed labor. Specifically the Dunbar boys, who took outside work in the slow season. He arrived at the kitchen door in the posture of a man who had decided that pride was less important than a roof fixed before spring. He found Della at the kitchen table with the household ledger. He stood in the doorway. "I owe you an apology," he said, though he said it more to the doorpost than to her. "Yes," she said, "you do." He looked at her then, directly, which she gave him credit for. "I wasn't raised to be that way," he said. "Then I'd suggest being something different," she said, which was more than he deserved and less than she could have said, and she returned to the ledger. The Dunbar boys helped him with his roof. By March the snow was thinning on the high ground, and the cattle had come through the winter better than anyone had reason to expect, and Caleb Dunbar was engaged to the school teacher in Harlan's Crossing, and announcing it to anyone who would hold still long enough. On a March evening, with the last light going amber gold across the rangeland, and the smell of the cook fire coming through the open window, Flint came into the kitchen and stood still for a moment, hat in his hands, the way he always held it when he was being serious, and she knew what was coming, the way you know when weather is about to change. "I want to ask you something," he said. She set down her spoon and turned to face him. "I've been thinking about asking since January," he said. "I kept finding reasons it wasn't the right time. I've decided that's something I do when I'm afraid of an answer, and I'm not interested in being afraid of you." She waited. "You came here for one night," he said, "and somewhere between October and now, this place became what it is, which is not the same place it was before you were in it." He looked at her with the steadiness she had come to trust. "I'd like you to stay, not as the cook, as the reason I light the lamp in the morning before I need it, because I know you'll be there when it's lit." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a horse shifted in the barn. Farther off, a meadowlark testing the March air. She had been braced for so long for the wrong version of this, the offer that looked like generosity and turned out to be a debt she hadn't agreed to, that it took her a moment to understand that this was not that. This was a man, hat in his hands, who had told her plainly he was afraid of her answer and decided to ask anyway. "You should know," she said, "that I am not easy to be with. I keep accounts of everything. I trust slowly. I will argue with you about the ledgers." "I know that," he said. "I've been watching you do it since October." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Yes to staying." He let out a breath she hadn't realized he'd been holding. They had supper that evening with the door propped open to the March air, which smelled of mud and thaw and the first faint green of something coming back, and Caleb Dunbar came in late and read the quality of the silence well enough to take his plate out to the barn without being asked. Spring came to the Carver spread the way it always did on high rangeland. Suddenly and entirely, like a door thrown open. The grass returned to the lower pastures in a week. The cottonwood trees put out pale new leaves, trembling in the April wind. The calves came, knock-kneed and insistent, and the mornings were loud with them. She stood in the kitchen garden with a trowel and cold mud under her boots and sun warm on her face, planting in the order her mother had taught her as a girl. Onions first, potatoes, then the cold, hardy greens. And she thought about the woman she had been on that boardwalk in October, scanning exits, counting 40 cents. She had been calculating exits her entire life. This spring, for the first time in longer than she could name, she was planning where the tomatoes would go. On a Sunday in April, Flint rode into Harlan's crossing and came back with a minister and, in what she suspected had been a very concise conversation, with no remaining ambiguity at the end of it, the appropriate legal paperwork. She was in the kitchen garden when he rode in. She looked at the minister and then at Flint, still on his horse. "You might have asked me first," she said. "I'm asking you now," he said. "The minister's here in case the answer is yes." She looked at the minister, who had found something worth studying in the direction of the far rangeland. "All right," she said, and pulled off her gardening gloves and went inside to wash her hands. They were married in the kitchen on a Sunday in April, with the Dunbar boys as witnesses, and the cook fire going, and the door open to the spring air. And afterward, Caleb produced a bottle of whiskey he had been saving, and they sat on the porch in the April light and watched the cattle on the greening lower pasture. "One night out of the wind," Flint said, with the tone of a man who finds something worth saying again. "It turned into something else," she said. "It did," he said. The ranch did well in the years that followed. The accounts balanced, then did better than that. The Dunbar boys stayed through summer, and they hired on a third hand when the herd grew. The kitchen garden produced more than they needed, and she began selling the surplus to the new hotel in town, whose cook was sensible enough to admit he needed help. In the evenings, when the work was done, and the light had gone the deep amber gold of a summer evening on the high rangeland, she would sit on the porch with Flint, and neither of them would talk much, because neither of them needed to, and the silence between them was not the silence of things left unsaid, but the silence of two people who had found, to their considerable surprise, given what they had each come from, that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. It was not a complicated story when she looked at it straight. A woman with 40 cents and a carpet bag had gotten into a wagon with a man who had said his name before he said anything else, and offered a roof and a wage, and the information that the door latched from the inside, and then waited for an answer without crowding her toward one. And she had stayed until spring, and then past spring, and the leaving had stopped seeming like the point of anything. Narrator to audience. Some stories are about the grand gesture, the one enormous moment that changes everything at once, and some stories are smaller than that, and better for it. A wind-cold afternoon in October, a man who said his name before he said anything else, a woman who had spent years calculating exits, and finally found somewhere she didn't want to calculate her way out of. This was the second kind. If this story found you well today, leave a comment and let me know what you're hoping for right now. I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this one, hit the like button, make sure to subscribe, and ring that bell. There's a new one every week, and I'd love for you to be there. Until next time.